Oh, yeah! Coming to you live from WRUEN, Tennessee. It's the Scribbling Woman.
Hi, I'm Nancy Rue. You're a scribbling woman too, so welcome back to Women Creating Writerly Lives. I've been watching a great mini-series on BritBox featuring the youngest Bennett sister in Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, because clearly there can never be too many spinoffs. A new episode airs every Wednesday, so come midweek, I've got my tea poured, my remote at the ready. Well, there will be 10 episodes, and last week I watched episode 9, and they left us with poor Mary racked with fever in her bed and her two suitors riding off into the sunset in opposite directions, leaving her without the hope that she had so held dear. And I absolutely said out loud, "No!" to the TV, and all I got was the credits rolling. Yeah, it just taunted me. Is it Wednesday yet? So I kind of did that same thing to you last time we gathered here. The session before that, we talked about increasing tension. And then last time in episode 62, I had you raising the stakes to leave you at the bleakest moment. And that's what episode 9 did. And I'm really sorry about that. However, I promised you that this week I would take us on the upswing. And I'm going to keep that promise as we open the curtain and develop Act 3. Now, the book is really divided into 3 acts, yes. Act 1 takes us from the usual world up into the inciting incident. The middle half is what we've been talking about, which is increasing the tension, raising the stakes, and it ends with the bleakest moment. The third act, of course, is different for every book, as is every writer different. We're always students of our own process. So if you are an intentional writer, as you listen to this, you may be making plans and jotting things down. If you're an intuitive writer, you may say, I'll keep that in mind as I make this up as I go along. But no matter what kind of writer you are, what happens in Act 3, this final quarter, has certain basic qualities. Now, the bleakest moment at the end of Act 2 has brought the protagonists to their knees. And we want the reader to think, I have got to see how she's going to get them out of this. And if you're an intuitive writer, you may be thinking the same thing. Well, here's one way, and it's always worked for me. So there are some steps for you to consider. First of all, refuse to stage a rescue that does not involve the protagonist in some way. So no damsel being carried from the dungeon by the fearless knight unless she is the one who distracts the guard so he can tote her to safety. All right? Do you remember Susie Schmo, whose husband has left her? She's trying to get her family back together and things did not work out. At the bleakest moment, at the beginning of Act 3, Susie Schmo's ex-husband does not return and say, I'm so sorry, it was all my fault. Please take me back. Nor does some totally forgotten relative die and leave her with $5.5 million. Now, Harold P. Schwartz, remember him? He wanted to go to medical school so that his wife would approve and so that his pride, could be met. He wanted to be important. He wanted to be a doctor, not just a nurse. But he has been accused of attempted murder, right? That's the bleakest moment. Well, Harold P. Schwartz's father-in-law does not bribe the judge to drop the charges because actually Harold isn't even guilty in the first place, nor does the real culprit suddenly appear and make a full confession. This is not Charles Dickens. It's not very satisfying, right? Instead, think about help, not a rescue, coming from an unexpected source. It's a piece of information, inspiration, incentive that comes from outside the protagonist that allows him or her to take the necessary action, right? So once that damsel has been rescued, now she has to take some action. There are various unexpected sources. I'm going to give you a few suggestions. But first of all, let me say this. Look at your own life, your writerly life. Have there not been times when you were in a situation there seemed to be no way out of, and someone said just the right thing, or you heard a song on the radio, or you saw a scene in a film and you went, wait, maybe that could work for me? When I was a very young mother 47 years ago. I was terrified. I had no idea what I was doing, and I just knew I was going to get it all wrong, and our child was going to end up being a topless dancer or shoplifter. And I was driving through Washoe Valley in northern Nevada one day, and postpartum was really, having its way with me. And on both sides of the highway, there were herds of cattle and many calves had been born. And those mamas were just standing there and the calves were nudging their udders and they were just drinking their breakfast. And mama was just looking so content. And I thought, I wish I was a cow. I wish I just knew exactly what I was doing. And suddenly a thought came to me, which was, why don't you just do what comes naturally? The help was a cow. And now I knew I was going to have to take some action. So in a story, the unexpected source could be a minor character. So Harold, as you know, is living with the old lady and taking care of her, right? And he has been accused of attempted murder, but he's out on bail. And the pizza delivery guy comes by, drops off the pizza, thanks him for the big tip. And he says, hey, that sexy chick who was here last time gave me like 50 cents. And Harold thinks, sexy chick? What sexy chick? And a light bulb goes on over his head. Aha. Another unexpected source could be an ally who's been lost but has returned. Because remember, when we're raising the stakes and increasing the tension, sometimes the allies fall away. So Susie's unlikely friend Jamaica, remember her? She was a recovering drug addict. She says, Susie, you really do know your daughter better than anyone. Where would she be? Because daughter has run away. And Susie goes, yes, I do know where she would be. This unexpected source could also be a symbol that's been there all along that gives something, gives a new meaning. So for Susie, it might be that locked church door. She sees that and she realizes, I so wanted to get in. Now I'm so happy to be locked out. For Harold, it could be the old man's cane parked in the corner. He used to see that symbol as the old man's crutch. Poor doddering old fool. And now he realizes the old man got strength wherever he could find it. This unexpected source could also be an antagonist who unwittingly gives something away. And this is delicious irony. So maybe that sexy little phlebotomist lets it slip that she knows where Harold's been living. Interesting. And finally, it could be a piece of knowledge that the protagonist already had that someone else kind of unknowingly reminds him of. The old man left a note for Harold saying, fight for yourself. Susie, her son, says caustically, what do you mean you don't know where she is? You always know where we are, even if we don't want you to. All right. So just because the protagonist now has information, has help, that doesn't mean that everything is solved. I did not immediately go home and pick up my crying baby and know exactly what to do. But I had to practice doing what was natural. Everybody was saying, let her cry it out. And I went, I'm not doing that. Come on, we're going to rock in the rocking chair. Child at 47 still loves to rock in a rocking chair. Okay, so the protagonist now has to get on his or her feet and move this thing to its conclusion using that information. So once Susie finds her daughter, now she has to convince her to trust her so they can work together. She doesn't just say, I'm not going to follow the rules anymore, sweetie. She's going to say, I broke every rule to get here and find you. And that's what we're going to do from now on. Now that Harold knows that the sexy little phlebotomist had an opportunity to drug the old lady and frame him for attempted murder, he has to gather evidence to prove that she actually did that. Now, this is where the big fight, the final battle, the ultimate confrontation takes place, because we're not done, right? The protagonist needs an opportunity to right the wrong, perhaps in a big way. Now, for me, that was more of a small way. There was a woman who babysat for my child when I was teaching. And every time I would pick her up and Mary Jean would start crying, the woman would say, give her to me. I know how to calm her down. And at one point I said, actually, so do I. I'm her mother. Now, in a novel, that happens in a bigger way. Harold has his day in court. He is exonerated, and little sexy phlebotomist is taken away in handcuffs. And before she leaves, he has a confrontation with her that says, You know what, you little blood-drawn chickie? You couldn't have any power over me. I know who I am. Maybe when you're in prison, you can find out. And he may actually have that same confrontation with his ex-wife. We're going to get to that in a minute. Susie and her daughter stand before the congregation and tell them what it really means to be a Christian, and it's got absolutely nothing to do with rules. That is their big moment. The protagonist has to have his day, her day. Now, in the process, whether the original goal is reached or not, the hidden need is met. Do you remember that? Way back at the beginning, we could see what the protagonist needed inside, right? Harold's goal was to go to med school and become a doctor. His hidden need was to let go of his pride. And when he does, he discovers that he's a compassionate caregiver, not a ladder climber. He loves where he is, even though he's now wifeless, even though he's not going to make as much money, even though he won't have the prestige of being an MD. Susie's goal was to get her family back together according to the rules of right and wrong. But when she knocks the last brick out of her wall of rigid rules, she sees herself as a woman of integrity that she was meant to be, a woman who can look at a situation and know what is right in that particular instance. So she counts her losses. She's lost her husband. Her son's still being a little creep. And she starts again from where she is with her daughter, with Jamaica, and a couple of foster kids she takes in. Now, once the action is taken and at least some portion of the hidden need is met, the novel then winds up in a chapter or two, depending on how many loose ends need to be realistically tied up. Most readers, myself included, don't want that neat bow where everyone lives happily ever after. We want real. So Harold ends up without either of the women, the lover or the wife, but that's not the point, right? The only woman in his life right now is the old lady, and he's going to take care of her until the end. I love Harold. Susie's son is still being a cheeky little sod, but she'll need to win his respect or lose him. He's going to respect her, or too bad for you, pal. But not only does she know how to do that, she also has authentic self-respect. Even in an ending where the original goal and maybe even subsequent goals haven't been met at all, there should be some satisfaction in what the protagonist has learned, some hope that it can be used in the future. We can be realistic without being cynical. In fact, I think cynicism is far less realistic than genuine optimism. Susie's story is not an expose about how church ladies can behave. They are not all going to come to her and say, "We're so sorry, please teach us how to be Christians." It's about how she wants to behave and the effect that has on the kids around her. Harold's story isn't about getting to medical school, even though that was his goal. It's about what his true purpose is. How then do we reveal that hidden need being met? Because plot is one thing, story is another. We want our readers to enjoy what happens, but even more importantly, we want them to experience what it all means. But not in the way of going through that novel, let's say The Scarlet Letter, back in English class in high school and saying, what is the message? The hidden need is the message, but how do we get that across? We don't want it to be sappy. We don't want it to be cheesy. It's not a, please forgive me, of course I forgive you, and then they ride off into the hills. It can't be preached like a sermon, so the reader feels like they've been spiritually mugged. There is no ending with a scripture verse, which I should have known all along. And we certainly don't want it to be stated like a moral at the end of a fable. Please do not include a sentence like this. Never again would Susie be the enforcer of rules. I don't want to read this either. Harold had learned his lesson. Never let pride tell you who you are. This is not Glinda the Good Witch in The Wizard of Oz saying, what have you learned, Dorothy? So how do we market? First, let's give the reader credit for being able to see it without having it completely spelled out. Resist the urge to explain. And then maybe consider some of these techniques, which might give you additional ideas. Near the end, you can put the protagonist in the same setting as they were in the first scene and let them see that setting in a whole new way. So let's say that in the first scene, Susie was posting rules on the refrigerator for her family. Do this, don't do that. Do this, don't do that. In the final scene, she has 2 foster children and her daughter, and Jamaica is there, and she's posting rules on the refrigerator, but they are guidelines like respect the dignity of every human being. Secondly, you could create a scene in which the protagonist would have handled it in the old way and show them doing things differently. All right, so after Harold is found not guilty and sexy phlebotomist is taken away to jail, there is a mediation, a settlement with his soon-to-be ex-wife. And when she starts in, as she did in the first scene, about how it would be so much easier if he made some decent money, he says, stop. And he says with compassion, this divorce is a good thing for you because I can never give you what you want. I'm telling you, I love Harold. And then thirdly, you can bring in a symbol that was formerly used to support their old way of being and allow the protagonist to dispose of it or see it for what it is. So we've got Susie passing the church that she fought so hard to be allowed back into, and she realizes it's just a building. If the hidden need has been made clear in your protagonist's former way of being, way back in Act 1, then the changes that you depict all through Act 2 with raising the stakes is going to leave your readers saying, good on you, Susie. And I knew you had it in you, Harold. And maybe I do too. Because the real purpose of a well-told story is to nudge the reader to look at themselves and ponder how they too might need to change, or simply have a sense that something is different now. If you think about the books that you have read before you became a writer, perhaps, that changed you in some way. When I was 15, I read The Great Gatsby on my own. It wasn't even assigned reading, and it affected me in a profound way. I just knew material things were not going to make me happy. They might even make me selfish. I wanted to be like Nick. Maybe I might find myself in the middle of it, but I wanted to have the courage to walk away. So look at the books that you have read and the things that have happened in your life. That's where we get our information. That's why we know to meet that hidden need. Now, in a sense, this whole process since episode 58, we've been building a bridge between where our protagonists began and where we wanted them to land. Act 3 is the final exit. We're off the bridge. The river has been crossed. And even if this new place is not perfect, even if it's not in some ways as comfortable as where they were in their usual world, our protagonist is different in some positive way. So let's raise a glass or an ice cream cone or a butter dripping piece of lobster on a fork. Let's raise a glass to that journey. And of course, you and I are not done. Now we get to do the really fun stuff, starting with making the people who populate your story and that journey deliciously real. That's next time. Now, until then, you might want to look at The Scribbling Woman Interactive Companion, Chapter 27, which reminds us about that hidden need. And there are some nudges that you can journal about or simply think on and ponder. You can also try The Emotional Craft of Fiction by Donald Moss. And I would show you a copy, but I keep buying them and giving them away to people. That's how good it is. If you want to review the main points that we've talked about today in this episode, you'll find those included in the description of the episode on YouTube. Other episodes related to this one are episode 20, episode 35, and episode 36. But if you want a list of all of the episodes by category, you can find that on the website, www.nancyrue.com/podcast. And now, Scribblies, it's time to take a bow.